In the 2000s, the iPod was a relatively significant and successful piece of Western technology and culture. It was the definitive MP3 player of its time, similar to the Walkman in the 80s and 90s, and similar to Spotify to this day. But today, you don't find the iPod anymore. So what was the last one like, and what happened to it? Those are some great questions, so let's get started. So before I actually get into this, we're going to look at a bit of history. I'm going to skip over a lot of details here because they're not really too much relevant to the story. So early stuff, what you need to know is that in late 2001, Apple released the iPod, the original one, which was quite successful, and the success of the iPod led to, in 2007, months after the iPhone's release, to Apple releasing the iPod Touch. We're gonna focus on the iPod Touch here because it was a hit. The first gen iPod Touch was offered at a lower price than the iPhone and wasn't hindered by the iPhone's select carrier system at the time. It also continued to get updates on a frequent basis, and in 2012, there was a bunch of new iPods. There was a new iPod Nano, and thus our brilliant little Apple Watch godfather is no more. There was a new iPod Shuffle, and there was also the iPod Touch 5th generation. The reason I bring up the 5th gen and these other iPods is because of the fact that this is kind of where the beginning of the end starts for the iPod, because those iPod Nanos and Shuffles were the last models of their respective branches. But they were still significant for other reasons, like the iPod Nano 7th Gen's very thin chassis. But when the next batch of iPods came around, it was a couple years later, and it was only an iPod Touch. Not to mention, it was fairly similar to the previous iPod Touch, which was the iPod Touch 5. And Apple kept this model around for a fair share of time. And by 2019, the processor that this iPod Touch used wasn't likely gonna stick around for the next release of iOS. And so Apple did a thing and announced that they're releasing a new iPod Touch. It came with an Apple A10 Fusion chip, and thus quote-unquote improving gaming performance. We'll test that later. And for a first, immersive AR, group FaceTime, and the 256GB model. Starting at $199, it was the cheapest offering for an iOS device, and it was available for order later that day on their website and their very well-designed retail stores. So how did the press respond to it? Writer Patrick Holland of CNET started by questioning why Apple would update the processor of a 4-year-old iPod and asked if it was a good idea to buy one. Though he liked its petite form, which he even said was cute, he wouldn't buy one because it was less appealing in comparison to the iPhone XS, and it would have been different if Apple updated the battery, camera, and the faceplate, even if it meant a higher price tag. He did say it could be useful for some niche cases, and that the best option was the 32 gig model, but overall the article said that it showed its age. Oh, well, we did have an instance of CNET criticizing an iPod in the past, have we? Writer Tom Gardenberg of The Verge said like it felt like an eternity since the iPod Touch 6, and that the updates to the iPod Touch 7 were lackluster. Gardenberg didn't say it was bad, remarking that it still had a headphone jack, which was X on the iPod Touch 7's cousin, and that it was an Apple device that gave you iOS for cheap, but it was nowhere near a flagship device. So I bet that gives you an idea that this device wasn't necessarily well praised. And by January of 2022, writer Zach Hall of 9to5Mac speculated the iPod Touch 7 would be the final iPod model. He said that next May, which would have been 2022, the iPod Touch 7 would be 3 years old, and that there were no rumors of an 8th gen iPod Touch, and that he bet that the iPod Touch would lose support for a newer version of iOS. Well, let's see what happened in May of 2022. The 10th of May 2022. The music lives on. iPod Touch supplies will be available while supplies last. Apple practically released an obituary for the iPod, and then tried to offer you different music devices, such as the HomePod Mini. That's right, it was the end of the iPod. And in October of 2024, Apple had properly announced that the iPod Touch, as well as the rotting corpse in the corner known as the iPod Nano, were properly obsolete. As a brief side note, this announcement was important to me because I had been using an iPhone 7, and the iPhone 7 was also being discontinued at the same time as the iPod Touch 7. This led me to change to use a Google Pixel 7, which I'm still using to this day. Now, before I actually talk about the device, I want to briefly go into a slight bit of detail on the backstory of this specific model. This exact model, down to the serial number, is a device that I've had for a particularly long time, as I got it shortly after the iPod Touch 7 was actually announced and released. It is in product red, which meant that the payment went to funding, I think, HIV and AIDS. You can also tell that this is my own device because it has my name engraved on the back of it. You could do this with the iPod Touch back in the day, and I found it quite neat. I think you could have also done this with the AirPods for some time, but I'm not sure. So I think we should take a look at the device now. So, on the top, we have the power button. On the left-hand side, we have the volume control buttons. On the bottom, we have speakers, the lightning port, and a headphone jack. On the rear, we have the antenna window, the flashlight, the camera, and the aforementioned engraving. On the front, we have the camera, the home button, and a roughly 4-inch screen. So now let's look at the device's software. This is running iOS 15, the latest version of iOS this device can run. And instead of going into each app, I'm going to do something different. Let's look at the performance of this by looking at a YouTube video. So, to put it simply, watching a YouTube video at 720p got this thing quite warm. What's worse is that when holding this device horizontally, your hands will cover the speakers, as if you're like doing something like watching a video or playing a game. However, if you're looking at the proper iPod experience, this thing can play music. It doesn't sound too bad, although I will admit it was a hassle getting these songs onto here because while I didn't have region issues, which sometimes occur when you load MP3 things onto a iOS device, but let's look at some gaming performance now because that's something that Apple brought up in its press release. Well, I have a story to tell you because the gaming performance on this thing sucks. Gaming performance on this thing was always terrible because, for example, even Minecraft sucked. It made the device warm, and that was even on normal settings. That being said, I'm not very familiar with mobile gaming because I don't do it a lot, and so I may not be the most familiar with it. Let's look at a number of games that I'm going to go through relatively quickly because I don't have too many comments on them, and so I don't really need to go in detail about them. Goat Simulator was the worst offender here, as it made the device so warm, although I recorded this right after the YouTube video part, that I decided to leave this sitting before I record the next game. 2D games are a bit better performing, such as 2048, Hill Climb Racing, and this generic city building game that I have. Shifting our attention back to 3D, relatively basic 3D can be perfectly good, such as Pokemon Quest, and I would argue that I'm not sure if this is EA's optimization for anything, but on the other end of the spectrum, a better performing 3D game with realistic graphics would be Real Racing 3. Though, as I alluded to not even 10 seconds ago, this game was made by EA. To finish things up, I want to look at some benchmarks, namely Geekbench scores. In terms of CPU results, the single core score is 572, while the multi-core score is 1093. The average for this specific device is 553 for the single core and 1067 for the multi-core, meaning that this specific iPod down to the serial number is somehow held up quite well. As for the compute score, the middle score was 2279, which is slightly just a hair better than the average score for this, which is 2272. For some context, the Apple A10 Fusion this thing is powered by has 2 cores and has a base frequency of 1.63 gigahertz and around 2 gigabytes of memory. And so that's that. As to why the iPod met its fate, I would presume that it mainly just wasn't viable to keep it around anymore because the announcement of its discontinuation said that supplies were still available. As to if you should get this thing, I think I can agree with the press that you don't really need this thing unless you're a collector, and there really aren't many viable reasons to use it unless you're looking for an older device or if you want to be a parent and give your children a phone-like device that isn't a phone. But I would argue, to put it simply, at least this device met a bit of a not as tragic fate as some other Apple products or other products in history, so I'll give it that.